right. I want you to do something. Make a fist with your right hand. Squeeze hard, not so hard you pull a muscle, but hard enough that you can feel the forearm tightening, the knuckles going white, the pulse starting to beat behind your thumb. Now hold it. Count to 90. 1, 2, 3. Go on. I'll wait. You probably think you were doing nothing, sitting there squeezing air. But while you were squeezing, something was happening inside your skull, up there, under the bone, behind the eyebrows, that you did not feel at all. A small patch of tissue, about the size of a postage stamp, on the left side of your brain, had just woken up. And what I want to do for the next little while is tell you why. Your brain is not smooth. It is crumpled up, folded in on itself the way you might wad a piece of paper to fit it in a drawer. And one of those folds, the one that runs sideways across the top of your head, like a seam on a baseball, is called the central sulcus. In front of that seam is the motor cortex. That is where your body sends its movement commands from. Now here is a thing that surprised me the first time I really looked at it. The motor cortex is a map. It is a map of your body, but it is a crooked one. The parts of you that need fine control, the fingers, the tongue, the lips, take up enormous territory. The parts that do not, the back, the trunk, the upper arm, take up almost nothing. If you drew your body at the scale of its motor cortex representation, you would get something that looked like a grotesque little person with giant hands and a massive mouth and a shriveled little torso. A man named Wilder Penfield at the Montreal Neurological Institute mapped this out in the 1950s by stimulating the brains of awake patients during surgery. He watched what twitched when he poked each little spot. He called the result the motor homunculus. It is still, 60-odd years later, one of the strangest pictures in all of medicine. And the hand takes up a disproportionate piece, close to a quarter of the whole motor strip, on each side. Your hand is, from the brain's point of view, one of the most important things you own. Now here is the second thing. Each side of the motor cortex controls the opposite side of the body. This is the crossover. The left hemisphere runs the right hand. The right hemisphere runs the left. So when you squeeze your right fist, the command is coming from your left motor cortex. And the harder and longer you squeeze, the more that patch of tissue has to work. Let me follow what actually happened when you made that fist. When you clenched your right hand, the signal had to come from a little loop of cortex that sticks out from the central sulcus like a knot on a tree. Radiologists call it the hand knob. From there, the signal runs down a bundle of axons called the corticospinal tract. It leaves the brain, passes through the brainstem, crosses over to the other side at the medulla, that is where the crossover happens, physically, a kind of anatomical X, and descends down the spinal cord to the level of the neck. From there, it fires the motor neurons that fire the muscles in your forearm, which pull on the tendons that run through the carpal tunnel, which close your fingers. 200 milliseconds, roughly, from the intention to the fist. But the interesting thing is not just the signal going down. It is what the motor cortex does while it is sending. That patch of tissue on the left side of your head, if you clenched your right fist, does not just fire once and go back to sleep. As long as you hold the contraction, it is active. It is drawing more blood. It is burning more glucose. The neurons there are firing in sustained bursts. The functional MRI scans show it. The EEG traces show it. The optical imaging shows it. You get a hot spot, a patch of cortex working harder than the tissue around it. 90 seconds of holding the fist, and you have just run a sustained asymmetric hemispheric activation. One side of your brain is working harder than the other, and if you switch hands, clench the left fist instead, the hot spot jumps. Now the right hemisphere is doing the work. The same thing, mirrored. This is not philosophy. This is geometry. Left hemisphere fires right hand. Right hemisphere fires left. You can see the crossover on a scan. But while one side of your brain is lighting up, something else is happening in your arm, and eventually in every artery downstream. Let me tell you about that. When you squeeze your fist, The muscles of your forearm tighten. They press inward, and what gets pressed, besides the muscle itself, is the network of small arteries and veins that run through the muscle. These vessels are soft. They collapse. Not completely, but enough that blood flow through that forearm drops sharply. Go back to your fist for a second. Feel the throbbing in the seconds after you release it. That is not relief. That is a specific biological event. It has a name: reactive hyperemia. Here is what happens. While you were squeezing, blood was pooling upstream of the compressed vessels. Oxygen was getting used up in the starved tissue. Waste products, carbon dioxide, lactate, adenosine, were accumulating. The tissue was in a state of mild temporary starvation, and when you let go, all that backed up blood suddenly surges through the vessel network. It rushes past the endothelial cells, the flat little cells that line the inside of every artery like bathroom tile, and it drags along their surfaces at a much higher speed than normal. The physicists have a word for that drag. It is called shear stress. And the endothelial cells do not like it, or rather, they respond to it. When shear stress rises, they switch on an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which manufactures a gas, nitric oxide, 2 atoms only, one of each, and releases it into the bloodstream and into the smooth muscle of the vessel wall. And the smooth muscle relaxes. The vessels widen. Blood flows more easily. Pressure drops. Now, this is not a guess. This is experimentally nailed down. Michael Scher and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins in 2015 did a beautiful experiment. They had people do an isometric hand grip inside an MRI scanner, and they measured coronary blood flow, the blood flow in the arteries that feed the heart itself, before and after. It went up. Then they infused the subjects with a drug called LNMMA, a molecule that blocks the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. They repeated the hand grip. The coronary dilation disappeared. No enzyme, no gas, no dilation. The mechanism is the gas. So here is what your fist actually did. It squeezed your arm vessels. When you let go, the rushing blood hit the endothelium hard enough to make it manufacture a vasodilator. And the vasodilator did not stay in your arm. Its effect traveled. Nitric oxide has a half-life in blood of only a few seconds, which means the molecule itself does not go far. But its downstream effects, the widened vessels, the lowered resistance, those persist for minutes, sometimes hours, in the whole cardiovascular tree. Your arm, your coronary arteries, and, if the effect is strong enough and repeated often enough, the blood vessels in your brain as well. So the fist is doing two things at once. It is lighting up one side of your brain, and it is painting your blood vessels with a gas that makes them relax. Now, you might think these are unrelated processes. They are not, because one of the places the blood vessels are relaxing and one of the places the hemispheric activation is being felt is the same place, which is the brain. And a psychologist named Ruth Proper, working at a small university in New Jersey, wondered whether the cortical activation in particular might do something to memory. Here is where the idea comes from. It goes back to a Canadian psychologist named Endel Tulving, who proposed in the 1990s something called the Hera model. H-E-R, ahemispheric encoding retrieval asymmetry. The idea was this: when you encode a memory, when you lay it down for the first time, your left prefrontal cortex does most of the work. When you retrieve that memory, when you pull it back up later, your right prefrontal cortex does more of the work. Encoding on the left, retrieval on the right. People argued about the model. Some brain imaging studies supported it, some did not. There was a real debate, but Ruth Proper at Montclair State University thought, if the model is right, I should be able to test it with something very simple. I should be able to push activation into one hemisphere using nothing but a hand. She ran the experiment in 2013. 51 right-handed volunteers. A list of 72 words to memorize. 5 groups. One group clenched the right fist for 90 seconds before memorizing the list, then clenched the right fist again for 90 seconds before recalling it. Another group clenched the left before both. A third group clenched the right before encoding and the left before recall, the group the Hera model predicts should do best. A fourth group did the opposite. And a fifth group, the control, did nothing with their hands at all. 90 seconds was not arbitrary. It was long enough to produce sustained cortical activation, but not so long that the subject got bored or tired. The results came out in PLOS-ONE. The group that clenched right before encoding and left before retrieval, exactly the Hera prediction, remembered more words than any of the other groups. The effect was not enormous, a few more words out of 72, but it was statistically clean, the predicted direction, the predicted asymmetry. Co-authors Sean McGraw, Tad Brunier at Tufts, and Michael Weiss saw the same thing when they checked the data. The striking part is what it means. You can, at least in principle, shift a little bit of your own cognitive machinery by squeezing one hand at the right moment. Encode something while the left hemisphere is warm. Retrieve it when the right hemisphere is. Your hand becomes, in a small way, a lever on your own brain. Now, I want to be careful here. The effect is modest. It has been tested more in word list paradigms than in, say, remembering faces, or remembering where you put your keys. The follow-up studies, of which there are a handful, have produced mixed results, some replications, some not. The field has not converged on exactly how big the effect is, or exactly how robust. It is a real effect. It is not a huge effect. You should not throw away your shopping list. But then there is a funny thing. If squeezing the left hand is supposed to activate the right hemisphere and help you retrieve a memory, why would squeezing the left hand also, according to a completely different line of research, help you keep from choking on a tennis serve? These two findings are supposed to fit together, and for a while they seemed to. And then a group in Munich looked more closely and found that the real picture is a bit weirder than the simple story suggests. The Munich group is led by Jürgen Beckmann at the Technical University of Munich. What Beckmann and his colleagues noticed is this. Athletes, the really good ones, the soccer players and judo experts and badminton servers, fail under pressure in a very specific way. They fail not because their motor skills are gone, but because they start paying too much attention to what they are doing. Their cortex, specifically the left, analytical, verbal, rule-following side, wakes up and tries to take over a process that was running beautifully on autopilot. The coach calls this choking. The psychologist calls it reinvestment, the mind reinvesting in a movement that ought to be left alone. Beckmann's idea was a strange one. If you could turn down the left hemisphere for a moment, just before the serve, just before the kick, maybe the automatic skill would get a chance to execute without interference. And how do you turn down the left hemisphere? You activate the right. And how do you activate the right? You squeeze your left fist. He tested it. He published it in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, General, in 2012. Soccer players, judo experts, badminton players, right-handed athletes who squeezed the left fist for about 15 seconds before a pressure task performed as well under the pressure as they had in practice. The right fist squeezers choked. Left fist. Better performance. Replicated across 3 sports. Published in a serious journal. But then came the EEG studies. Florian Krosvyasana, also at the Technical University of Munich, hooked people up to electrodes and actually watched what the brain was doing during and after a left-hand contraction. What he found, in a paper in PLOS-ONE in 2015 and replicated by several groups since, was not quite what the simple Hera story would predict. What he found was that after you contract the left hand, the entire cortex gets a little quieter, not just one side. Both sides. The EEG alpha power, which goes up when neurons are firing less, increased across the whole scalp. Meaning, squeezing the left hand does not just tilt the seesaw, it lowers it. It produces, for a few seconds after you let go, a kind of cortical deep breath, a general quieting. That makes a new kind of sense for why it would help an athlete. The athlete does not need more hemisphere. The athlete needs less cortex. The skill is subcortical. It lives in the cerebellum, in the basal ganglia, in the spinal cord. The cortex is the thing that is interfering. Squeezing the left hand, briefly, is like telling the cortex to hush. The puzzle is why the left hand, specifically, would have this effect and not the right. Cross-Vilasana's own discussion notes that the right hemisphere, which receives primary input from the left hand, may have connections to subcortical inhibitory networks that the left hemisphere does not share in quite the same way. That part is partly a guess. The asymmetry is real. The exact wiring is still being worked out. Now I want to step back and add one more mechanism to this chain. Because if you take that squeezing and repeat it, not once, but for a few weeks, a few times a week, you can do something to your blood pressure that genuinely surprised the cardiology people when they first saw it. Here is the protocol. You take a hand dynamometer, a little device that measures grip strength. You squeeze it once, as hard as you can, to find out what your maximum is. Call that your maximum voluntary contraction. Now you take 30% of that, about a third of your strongest squeeze, and you sustain that grip for 2 minutes. Then you rest for 4 minutes. You squeeze again. Then rest. Then again. Then rest. 4 rounds total. It takes about 24 minutes, most of which is sitting still. And you do this 3 times a week, for 8 weeks. That is the isometric hand grip training protocol. It was developed in the early 2000s, refined at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, by a group including Neil McCartney, Maureen MacDonald, Cherry McGowan, and Philip Millar. They ran a series of randomized controlled trials on hypertensive patients. What they found was something you would not expect from an exercise that does not raise your heart rate, does not make you sweat, and does not burn any noticeable amount of calories. After 8 weeks, resting systolic blood pressure dropped, in some trials by as much as 10 millimeters of mercury, in others by 5 or 6. In the pooled analyses, meta-analyses that combine the data from many such trials, the average reduction in isometric training studies came in at around 9 millimeters of mercury for the top number and around 4 for the bottom. 9 millimeters does not sound like much until you know what it buys. Every 5 millimeter reduction in systolic blood pressure, in the big population studies, corresponds to roughly a 10% lower risk of heart attack and about a 14% lower risk of stroke. Multiply by 2, and you have the kind of effect that a cardiologist writes prescriptions to achieve. The most recent meta-analysis, by Jamie Edwards and colleagues at Canterbury Christ Church University, published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2023, pooled the data across 270 randomized controlled trials, nearly 16,000 people total. They compared aerobic training, resistance training, high-intensity interval training, and isometric exercise. Isometric exercise came out on top, not second, on top from squeezing a ball for a few minutes, 3 times a week. And the mechanism, when you dig into it, turns out to be the same mechanism we started with, the one about nitric oxide and reactive hyperemia. Repeat the compress and release over and over for weeks, and the endothelial cells get better at it. They upregulate the synthase. They become more sensitive to shear stress. They release more gas on less provocation. The vessels over time become a little more relaxed at rest. The total peripheral resistance goes down, and with it, the pressure. Let me pause for a moment and tell you exactly how confident to be in each of these findings, because they are not all at the same level of certainty. The blood pressure effect of isometric hand grip training, that one is about as solid as exercise physiology gets. Multiple randomized controlled trials, multiple meta-analyses. The nitric oxide mechanism has been directly demonstrated with blocker drugs that turn the enzyme off and make the effect disappear. If you have high blood pressure and you ask your cardiologist whether isometric hand grip training is worth trying, you are asking about a real intervention with real evidence behind it. First-tier evidence. The choking under pressure effect, the Beckman finding, is well replicated across sports and research groups, and the EEG correlate, the bilateral cortical quieting, has been replicated in at least 2 independent labs. I would call this effect well supported. Second tier. We are still working out why specifically the left hand does it and the right hand does not, and how large the effect is for ordinary people who are not skilled athletes. The Hera memory effect, the proper finding, right clench then left clench improves word recall, is the least certain of the 3. It is based on a small number of studies. The effect is modest. Replications have been mixed. It is physiologically consistent with what we know about hemispheric asymmetries, but it is not something you should rely on for an exam. Third tier. An interesting lead, not a tool in the toolbox yet. And below all 3, there is another category altogether. The online claims that fist clenching raises dopamine, fixes your mood, sharpens focus, wakes up your brain chemistry, those are not well supported by the studies we have. They sound like things that ought to be true, which is exactly the kind of claim you should be most suspicious of. I am suspicious of those claims. You should be too. Now here is the thing that gets me. The endothelial pathway, nitric oxide, cyclic GMP, smooth muscle relaxation, that is the most monetized pathway in modern cardiology. The drug that made Pfizer, for a couple of years in the late 1990s, the most profitable pharmaceutical company on earth, sildenafil, brand name Viagra, works on that pathway. It does not produce nitric oxide. It prevents the second messenger, cyclic GMP, from being broken down. The effect is the same. Vessels dilate. Nitroglycerin, which has been used for angina since the 1800s, works on the same pathway. It releases nitric oxide directly into the bloodstream. The AC inhibitors, ramipril, lisinopril, all the PRIL drugs prescribed for blood pressure, lower the activity of a hormone called angiotensin. Different entry point, same downstream consequence. Vascular resistance goes down. These drugs have their place. They are stronger than a hand grip. A 60-year-old man with severe hypertension who has been told by his doctor to cut the salt and lose weight and take the little white pill every morning is not going to manage his condition on grip alone. That would be foolish. The pharmaceutical version exists for a reason. The body's own version is not always enough. But, and here is the honest part, the body has the machinery. The enzyme is there. The signaling cascade is there. The smooth muscle receptors are there. The difference between what your hand can do in 2 minutes of squeezing and what a 20 milligram tablet does is a matter of dose, not of mechanism. When you squeeze your fist and your arteries widen, you are running at a milder intensity the same program that the pharmaceutical industry has spent decades bottling, patenting, and selling. The hand grip is not a replacement for medicine. But the idea that medicine is the only thing that can move that pathway, the idea that relaxation of the vascular system requires a prescription, that idea is wrong. Think about the person over 60 who has been told for a decade that their blood pressure is too high, that they need to lose weight, that they should walk more, that they should meditate, that they should try harder. Who has tried? Who has found the meditation boring and the walking painful? Who has been prescribed a pill that sometimes makes them dizzy? To that person, the idea that a device costing $20, used for 12 minutes 3 times a week for 8 weeks, could produce a blood pressure reduction comparable to a first-line drug, that idea is not trivial. That is the kind of thing that changes what a person can afford to do with their remaining years. My grandmother, who had strong opinions about most things, used to say, when someone was getting angry, make a fist. Let it out in the fist. Then open your hand. She thought it was about venting. She did not know about nitric oxide. She did not know about the motor cortex or the Hera model or the cortical quiet that comes after a contraction. She knew, from watching people her whole life, that something happened when you clenched your hand and then let it go. The shoulders dropped. The jaw loosened. The heart rate came back down. Science caught up to her about 100 years later. So here is what I am going to ask you to do. Make a fist. Right hand, left hand, either one. It does not matter much today. Squeeze hard. Hold it for a moment. Let it go. Feel what rushes back in. Now tell me, in whatever way you tell these things to a video, which hand you squeezed and what you felt the second after you let it go.